Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt deeply connected to the sufferings of others, even though their experiences may seem different from your own? Well, I have, and let me tell you the story. I was born in one of the world's poorest countries and during one of the worst humanitarian crises. The Liberian 14-year civil war shaped my life into 3 chapters. I began chapter 1 as a child when my family and thousands other families struggled daily for food, shelter, and survival through the civil war. By the age of 6, our bedtime stories were filled with violence and trauma. And one of the stories that left a deep impact on my young mind was about a pregnant woman who was cut open by a group of armed men who wanted to verify whether her baby was a boy or a girl. I began chapter 2 with a study abroad scholarship to the United States. As a peace studies major, I was constantly reading, researching, and evaluating different forms of violence and aggression. Every time I watch a video about Palestine or Nigeria, it felt like an alarm would go off in my head because subconsciously, I saw myself as part of those victims. I quickly realized that not only am I connected to the trauma from Congo, Sudan, Ukraine, and other war-torn areas, but that my triggers were intertwined with their sufferings. And the voices in my head kept saying, run, run. But where? With the daily news of gun violence in the United States, nowhere felt safe. I was constantly on edge and had trouble sleeping at night. And my grades started dropping. But failure for me was not an option because it meant losing my scholarship and being sent back home. And the thought of this was very painful because in a family of about 20 boys and girls, I'm the first girl to go to college. My family would be devastated. So I held on. Until one day, while watching a video in class, I experienced a traumatic breakdown. I was scared, and by the end of the class, I was sitting in the professor's office crying and wanting to drop the course. She recognized I needed help and assisted me in seeing a therapist. I was then diagnosed with severe anxiety, PTSD, and depression. It felt strange because I never thought Africans could have mental illness. It felt so awkward talking to a stranger about how I felt impacted by things that happened decades ago. But I was grateful to talk to someone. Not long after, a friend asked about my doctor's appointment. And when I mentioned seeing a therapist, he went, ha ha ha, you've also become a white woman? You know our African family gonna think you've gone crazy, right? I felt incredibly invalidated and began to question if I was truly overreacting. So after a few sessions, I stopped seeing a therapist. I felt ashamed of my weakness and desperately wanted to maintain this facade of normalcy as an African. And gradually, it got so worse that it became so hard to act normal that I isolated myself for almost 2 years, except for attending school. And by winter 2020, it's gotten worse to a point where I began to question if anybody would miss me if I were to leave this world. And when I closed my eyes, all I saw was my little sister looking right back at me with so much love and dependence. And I knew there was someone who cared about me. But I couldn't make these thoughts go away. Thankfully, my friend Chloe visited my dorm during this time and encouraged me to see the therapist again. As a result, I was sent to the hospital and put on medications that helped me stabilize. But my heart felt empty because I needed answers. And one day, I read this article from a CEO who was quitting his job to take care of his mental health. I was first, surprised, and then validated and relieved because seeing the CEO publicly prioritize their well-being inspired me to question why should I feel ashamed to do the same? And it gave me the strength to understand and confront my trauma. And that was when Bassel's book, The Body Keeps the Score, helped me understand that childhood trauma, big or small, are never forgotten by our brain, mind, and body, but they can be processed so they don't hurt us anymore. The US National Library of Medicine also published a few articles indicating the significant impact of PTSD following a traumatic event and how sharing of similar events on social media or the news can increase our rates of PTSD. Findings from this research raise a pressing question for me. If violence contributes not only to short-term disasters, but also has long-lasting consequences, then why aren't more people speaking up against it? As a student of peace studies, I feel really sad when ordinary people feel disempowered into believing that our individual actions are insignificant in promoting global peace. In the studies Why Civil Resistance Work, Chenwa and Stephen found that 53% of nonviolent movements achieved their goals compared to only 26% of violent movements. And it is just 3.5% of our population actively engaging in nonviolent protests to bring about significant political change. And democracies formed through nonviolence exhibit greater stability compared to those formed through violence. So what does this mean for us? Before I tell you what it means, I want you to raise your hands if you've ever felt scared or anxious talking about trauma. Keep it up if you've ever felt it was ridiculous to engage with somebody to talk about war peace. If you raise your hands for either of these, then welcome to my chapter 3. I am going to show you a simple framework that we can all start using today to process our trauma and easily start conversation with others about war peace. It's based on acknowledgement, conversations, and healing. The first step after encountering a traumatic event is to allow ourselves to process the trauma by acknowledging it. To do this, you grab your pen and your paper, then write a fictional story about a character that have experienced the exact event. Describe their emotions and validate them. Let's take, for example, a public named Mary. During a fight between Mary's parents, she felt sad, unsafe, and lonely. But instead of rejecting those feelings, she accepted them because they are valid. Then consider replacing a character with yourself. Give yourself the same attention and care to process and release the traumas that will otherwise remain trapped in your body. The second step is conversation. A simple way to start conversation with others about trauma and peace could bring fictional characters like Mary and encourage friends and family to engage in conversation about safety and support. And I know some of you might be like, nah, that was too personal for me. That's fine. Imagine yourself sitting at a dining table with your family, on a bus of strangers, or maybe chatting on social media with your followers, and introduce simple questions like, what does home mean to you? How beautiful would it be if we had a trauma-free society? Or what would war peace look like? Open-ended questions like these offer us the chance to educate and engage with others about discussing the impact of trauma and nonviolence, which not only fosters a sense of belonging, but also inspires actions from them. And the third step, healing, becomes natural when we have safe spaces to process our trauma, engage with each other, and show up for each other because our actions count. As a survivor, every time I see support for nonviolence or trauma relief, it tells me that there is hope because people care about the experience of survivors like me and for the safety of those in conflict zone. Before I leave, I want us to remember that trauma is not just for certain individuals. It's a universal illness, often hidden behind this mask called a smile. Therefore, I'm inviting you to join this movement for a better world by creating safe spaces that destigmatize mental illness, validate the experience of trauma survivors, and allow for open dialogues on global peace. And while it might seem slow, I am confident that together we can achieve war peace and build a society in which all of us feel safe. Thank you.